Hello everyone, welcome to the Orchid Hut. My name is Dana. Thank you to all of the new subscribers, and I'm really enjoying interacting with the comments that you guys leave. So please keep that up. Today's video is going to be a little bit of a mixed bag, and it's just going to be a chit chat about various different things that are happening with orchids, and just kind of like what's going on in my part of the world and how it relates to my orchid growing. So the first thing that we're going to start with is the weather for this week in my area. I'm going to put up a little bit of a weather forecast for you so that you can see, but our nighttime temperatures are dropping into the 50s for the most part. We do have another little cold front pushing through midweek that will cause the nighttime temperatures to drop a bit lower. My winter resting Dendrobiums are staying completely outside unless the weather drops below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And the other orchids that I typically grow outdoors are in the garage during the night, and the temperature in the garage can be maintained now about 6 or 7 degrees warmer than what it actually is outside. So, for right now it's okay, but there will come a point when I'm not able to trap enough of the warmth from the daylight hours to be able to maintain that difference in temperature overnight. So I am watching that carefully to see when I actually just need to bring them indoors completely. And you'll notice on the weather map also that the humidity is high, like 90-something%. And I think the reason that it was reading like that this morning is that we have had several mornings in a row with a lot of dense fog. And I believe that fog is driving up the humidity percentage, but during the day that goes away, and the weather is not feeling like the 90-something% humidity like we usually have in the summer. So it's a time of the year when you have to be careful because the coolness and the humidity and all of that can cause problems, especially if you're overwatering. So over the weekend, my orchids were all checked, and many of them had not been watered for a while. So since yesterday was a warmer day, very bright and sunny, the orchids that were dry did get a drink of water because it was a good day to do it when it was bright and sunny and a bit warmer. And many of them will not get water for quite a while. Even though I will continue to check in with them, they will not be getting water simply because of the cooler temperatures. Okay, so that's a little bit about the weather here and what's going on. My indoor orchids, I would say, are experiencing nighttime temperatures around maybe like 64, 65 degrees Fahrenheit because we don't turn the heat on overnight. We might bump the heat on for a little while in the morning when we first get up, but overnight they're experiencing temperatures in the mid-60s. And that may or may not cause some of the Phalaenopsis to start putting on spikes, if they're the type of Phalaenopsis that even gets triggered by that. So we'll, kind of watch that and see how that goes. But for most of today's video, I wanted to talk about the very mixed collection of things that I have in front of the camera. So let's start with this little Tolumnia that was repotted in this decorative pot a few weeks back, and it's doing well. It's very, very healthy, and it has 2 new fans that are growing nicely. So there's a new fan right here, and then there is another new fan right here. And I'm being very, very careful with watering this, especially when the temperatures are cool. You know, it's been in the garage, getting light during the day because I can, open the door. But I'm maybe giving it a trickle of water every, maybe 4 or 5 days at the most. And yesterday when it got some water, I did put the tiniest bit of light feed in there because this orchid is growing. It's trying to put up those new fans and it needs that food for energy, even though the time of year is a little bit inconvenient for figuring out how to water it. So this one is doing well. Okay, and then the next one that I want to talk about is this Dendrobium. And this kind of falls under the category of being a keen observer, again, of your orchids. Because I showed this one to you a while back when these 2 new canes were just really, really small. And now you can see that they've grown, both of them have grown, an inch or more since the last time I showed it to you. But the other thing that I'm noticing is that the older canes are becoming more shriveled than they were initially. And there's a couple of things that could be going on with that. First of all, I repotted it and I disturbed its old root system. And then secondly, because the weather was getting cooler and this one was still outside, I did not want to overwater it because that's the quickest way to destroy your Dendrobium roots, is to have it be too wet and cool at the same time. So what I'm going to be doing with this orchid now is I'm going to be just moving it indoors for the rest of the winter season. I think this is more of an intermediate growing Dendrobium, and it probably would be happier with slightly warmer temperatures where I can keep it a bit better hydrated. I did kind of peek down in the bark here where these new growths are, and they are sending down new roots. It's a little bit difficult to show on camera because of the angle, but there are new roots going down into the media from those new growths, and I want to be able to keep this well watered enough so that these older canes don't stay maybe quite as shriveled, and of course so that the new growth can have what it needs for its roots. So I'm going to be changing this one up a little bit and bringing it indoors, and hopefully that will make a bit of a difference. Okay, so that's that one. And then this next orchid also falls under the category of paying keen attention to what's going on. Okay, so I don't believe I've ever shown this one to you before. It's one of the ones that has changed names numerous times, probably. Let's see if we can get the tag here. This is originally, I think, labeled as an encyclia, but then renamed to Prosthecia. And cochleata is also part of what's going on here. It says green, black, shell, lip, warm. So I believe this is an orchid that has had numerous name changes. But it has been mounted now on this piece of cork bark for maybe 4 or 5 years. And when I started with it as a plant, it had 2 more pseudobulbs over here, which have since been removed, and maybe this one and 1 more. And as you can tell, these, now have lost their leaves, and these are the pseudobulbs that will be on their way out as I continue to work with this orchid, because the newer part of the plant is on this side here. And it has really done well on this mount for years, growing, hanging right by the door of the orchid hut. And this year, I noticed that something was going on. It did not seem to be thriving like it had in the past. And I also noticed on the ground underneath where this orchid was hanging there was like little collections of sawdust here and there. I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. But then as I continued to watch this mount, I would notice from time to time that it had wood ants crawling on it. Now I'm going to insert a picture of wood ants in the video so that you can kind of see what they look like if they're not something that thrives in your area. They are just prolific here in Southeast Texas. And they're not quite as detrimental to wood as like termites, but they do chew through wood. Well, eventually I figured out that those southern wood ants were causing the sawdust underneath this mount. And then as I inspected this mount even more closely, there were places where the wood ants were burrowing tunnels into the cork bark. And you can see some of their holes there, and this is where the sawdust was coming from. So they were burrowing into this mount. Okay, so there's some holes there, and if you can see, like on the top of that cork bark, there are some holes that have been burrowed at the top of that mount. Now this is not good, because probably what's happening is that those wood ants have burrowed behind the plant, have probably disturbed the roots, have maybe even damaged some of the roots, and I think this is why this orchid was not thriving as well as it had been in the past. So, my plan for this orchid is to remount it at some point. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the other thing that happened during the growing season is that 3 of the new little buds blasted. So they started and then they just turned black and they fell off. So there were 2 buds that blasted down here, or 2 new growths that blasted down here. Now it does have 1 more that looks like it might make it. And then there was a new growth that blasted right here, but now it's sending up another one. And this is the 1 new growth that looks like it might make it. So as soon as I see some new root growth from these buds, I will be removing this from the mount and putting it on a fresh piece of cork bark, because I think those southern wood ants have gotten to this, and in fact, even if I feel the bark like this now, cork bark doesn't typically go soft, but this is far more flexible and sort of soft feeling than what it should be. So I'm waiting for the appropriate time. There is maybe a bloom sheath right here. This orchid has never bloomed for me. So I was really hopeful that maybe that bloom sheath would give me a bloom spike. I don't know if that will happen now. I'm probably going to have to focus on saving it first and worrying about blooms later. Okay, so that's the story with that one. Now, let's have a look at these 2. This is a case of Phalaenopsis still in the growing season. So both of these Phalaenopsis were keikis that I grew from bloom spikes. And they're actually both about 1.5 years old. The reason that they're different in size is because this one was a keiki from a large Phalaenopsis, and these 2 were keikis from a miniature Phalaenopsis. So that's the reason why they're different in size. But just recently, this one is putting on a new leaf. Orchids will do what they want to do when they want to do it. And this one is putting on a new leaf. There is the tiniest of a new leaf also happening at the top of this one, as well as new root growth beginning to happen. So when I watered these orchids yesterday, these were dry, and I gave them just the tiniest bit of fertilizer because they are growing. It's not the typical season when you would expect Phalaenopsis to start putting on new leaf growth, But that's what these two are doing, and they need the support of a tiny little bit of fertilizer and careful watering so that they don't stay too wet. Okay, so that's those two. And this one. Okay, so this orchid, I know it's kind of tall here. This orchid was one that I purchased on my Houston orchid shopping spree extravaganza, maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago now. And it was, one of these pots inside a pot. And I've been doing my method here of pulling the plastic down and making sure that this moss doesn't stay too wet. But I want to show you what I notice happening here. And this is very typical of what can happen when you buy orchids like this. These bloom spikes were just barely starting to open when I purchased this, and many of the buds were still not open, and in fact you can see some of these buds are not even open. Phalaenopsis blooms typically last for months and months. So the fact that this one did not finish opening, and you can even notice that some of the blooms are starting to wilt and fade already, while the rest of it hasn't even finished blooming. Okay, this is a sign of stress. There's no reason why this bloom shouldn't have lasted all winter. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, what's going on? The next thing that I notice is that the leaves have become floppy. Now, this orchid was not like this when I purchased it. These leaves were nice and straight and stiff, and this floppiness now is a sign of dehydration. And it's not because the moss hasn't been kept wet enough for the roots. The problem is that the root system is starting to fail. So even though I've been keeping this moss damp, you can tell that the roots are not healthy. They are beginning to shrivel, they're beginning to turn brown, and roots like this cannot support an orchid. So it could be that this one at some point becomes a lost cause. I will be repotting it today to see what I can salvage, see if I can figure out if there's enough of a root system left to still support this. The bloom spikes are going to have to go. That's draining far too much energy from the orchid. It's going to need to be rehydrated with whatever good roots it has left, and I may give it my tea treatment. If I decide to do that, I'll make sure to video it. But this one's not doing well, and often this is what happens, especially in my area. I don't know if it's because of the humidity or just where these orchids come from, but in my area, orchids purchased inside those tight little flimsy pots, if they're not repotted like almost immediately when you get them into your home environment, they oftentimes begin to do this and start to fail. So I'll be taking care of that today. Okay, and the last thing I want to share with you are these little puffed clay balls, often called hydroton, sometimes referred to as leca, because I believe that's the registered name for these. But they're puffed clay balls, and you find them oftentimes mixed in with other orchid media. And many orchid growers just use these in the orchid pots, and it's kind of like a semi-hydro setup where there's a wick that runs into these clay balls, and the clay balls are able to absorb moisture from the wick, and you really don't have to otherwise water or worry about the orchid's hydration. I have never tried this in my environment, mostly because I haven't researched it well enough to come to a conclusion about whether it would even work for me. But there's something that I'm curious about with these puffed clay balls. And if you guys, anybody, if you already know the answer to this, please leave me a comment. But I want to know if the inside of this clay ball is hollow, or if it's solid through and through. And I'm curious what happens when you fertilize an orchid and you just have this as media. Okay, so I'm going to use my sort of science teacher background here, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of an experiment with this. It might be a bit of an advanced idea that I have, but if it works out, I will share it with you, and if it doesn't work out, well, you may never hear about it again. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of an experiment with this and fertilizer, and I want to see what happens. Okay, so part of growing orchids is having curiosity and experimenting and exploring with new ideas. Okay, so that's the end of today's video. Very much a mixed bag. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you would like to have more sort of random videos like this. Sometimes they're a little bit fun when you don't exactly know what the content is going to be. And the subscribe button will be coming up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to hit the little bell button, the notifications button, and that way you'll get a little reminder when I've posted a new video and there's something new to watch. Okay, thanks so much. I hope you have a great day, and talk with you next time.